Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Silver Screen War Machine, Decoding the Military Entertainment Complex. A lot of very interesting things that we're going to be talking about today. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Professor Mickey Huff. I'm the director of Project Censored and the president of the Media Freedom Foundation. Again, welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here on a Tuesday evening or afternoon, depending where you are. I know that some of you are on the East Coast and everywhere in between. I'm here on the left coast in Northern California. But again, thanks for joining us for this timely panel discussion, Silver Screen War Machine, Decoding the Military Entertainment Complex. We're very excited to introduce our featured expert panelists today, and we will do so in just a moment. But first, I want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. And the first order of housekeeping really is a thank you. I want to thank all the wonderful people at the Media Education Foundation, MediaEd.org, Emily, Alex, everyone there. It's been wonderful to work together. We at Project Censored are honored to partner with Media Ed on this event, and we hope to do more events together and have more dialogue around these really important issues moving forward. Of course, we are also thrilled that so many of you are joining us. And of course, we're thrilled about our panelists. Housekeeping. If you have questions, you can add questions to the Q&A box. Those are little conversation bubbles at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And that's where we'll be looking for audience questions throughout the panel discussion. So try to keep your questions out of the chat and pop them over into the Q&A box to be sure that they get seen and collated and put through. I'll do my best to get to all the questions and comments, although this event is running for 90 minutes and it ends at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. We are recording this panel discussion. As you can see, it will be available as a video, and we'll send an email to all participants ensuring that you can have access. Also, if you hadn't had a chance to watch the film, this panel is about the wonderfully important documentary Media Education Foundation has put together with the filmmaker ROGER STAHL, Theaters of War, how the Pentagon and CIA took Hollywood. So if you haven't had a chance to see this great movie yet, the Media Education Foundation has decided to extend free access through the end of Thursday, March 7th. I think they'll be adding the link to the chat right now, so be sure to save the link if you haven't gotten a chance to watch the film. It's a very significant film. I've been showing it in class for the past year. Students respond to it really well. It's a wonderful conversation starter about, well, something we need to know a lot more about. And our panelists today are going to help enlighten us even further. If you're interested in using Theaters of War in your own work through licensing it for your college or university or hosting a community screening, Media Education Foundation will be putting information about that into the chat now as well. And also sending out an email with more information later in the week for interested parties. And also, of course, you can learn more at MediaEd.org. If you want to learn more about our work at Project Censored as a media watchdog, you can find out more at projectcensored.org. Well, on to the panelists. Let's introduce everybody here. So on with the show. If you're an educator, it's a good bet that most of your students have spent hours upon hours perched in front of screens watching blockbuster military and war-themed movies like Top Gun Maverick, Zero Dark 30, or Argo. It's also a good bet they, like most Americans, know next to nothing about the direct role that the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, have played in making and shaping many of these movies. But does all of that military machinery on screen come with strings attached? Does the military actually get a crack at the script? Should Hollywood help promote the military's agenda by systematically scrubbing its films of war crimes, corruption, racism, sexual assault, coups, assassinations, and torture? And should the Pentagon be legally obliged to let the public know when they've been involved in a film or other entertainment like NFL football games, right? We're going to talk a lot about that today. Let me introduce our panelists. The first is ROGER STAHL. He's the filmmaker. ROGER STAHL is professor of communication studies at the University of Georgia. ROGER spent much of his career studying propaganda and public relations, or PR, as it relates to selling military interventions. He has written extensively about how the entertainment industries play a role in this process, what some have called the military entertainment complex. In addition to documentaries on the subject, Roger's books include Militainment, Inc. and Through the Crosshairs, War, Visual Culture, and the Weaponized Gauge. Roger Stahl, welcome to the panel. Our next, thanks so much. Our next panelist is Robin Anderson. Robin Anderson is Professor Emerita of Media Studies at Fordham University, an award-winning author, writer, and media commentator. She writes for us at Project Censored, as well as Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Counterpunch. She's an opinion columnist for Al Jazeera as well. She currently edits the Routledge Focus book series on media humanitarian action. Her forthcoming co-edited book, Censorship, Digital Media, and the Global Crackdown on Freedom of Expression, that she did with Nolan Higdon and Steve Masick, will be published by Peter Lang later this month. And we just had Robin and Steve and Nolan on the Project Censored show last week. Week before that, we had Roger Stahl. Robin Anderson, welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Mickey.
You're very welcome. FATOOMA SAAD, another panelist, is a doctoral student with Wayne State University's Department of Communication. FATOOMA holds a master's degree in communications and is a Defense Information School-trained veteran with experience in military communication and public affairs strategies. She has recently leaned on her own experiences in the military to shed light on the expansive yet often ignored relationship between the Department of Defense and Hollywood filmmakers and their goal of shaping military narratives in pop culture. Her research often centers around the belief that the military, which boasts the largest share of the U.S. budget, should be accessible and relatable to the average non-serving citizen. FATOOMA SAAD, welcome to the panel today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mickey. I'm glad to be here tonight.
And finally, MNAR ADLEY. MNAR ADLEY is a Palestinian-American journalist. She is the founder, director, and editor-in-chief of the independent outlet MintPress News at mintpressnews.com. She's also the president of the nonprofit organization Behind the Headlines. MNAR is the 2023 recipient of the Women in Media Award from the Women's Institute for Freedom of the Press. MNAR ADLEY and her senior writer, Alan McLeod, have written and published extensively about propaganda, about censorship, about the military entertainment complex, as well as about the collusion that we see between the military, contractor companies, and the media, as well as video game companies that have been used to manipulate and train younger people and sort of, well, you want to hear the word grooming these days quite a bit, but not in this context, right? So I'm sure that there's plenty to discuss today on the panel, and our experts are going to kick things off for us right now. So finally, last but not least, folks, I'm Mickey Huff, again, the director of Project Censored, president of the Media Freedom Foundation. I'm also a professor of history, social science, and journalism at Diablo Valley College in Northern California, where I'm co-history of the history area. I'm also the chair of the journalism department. You can learn more at projectcensored.org. Let's get started here today, folks. And Roger Stahl, we're going to start with you. And we can consider this maybe sort of an opening salvo or sort of an opening question. We want to talk about, well, what is the genesis of your work in general, like your publications and now your latest film, Theaters of War. Let's talk about the subtle ways that military propaganda narratives get woven into even non-military films and non-military programs, right? This is something that people may find as quite a surprise. So this first round, we're going to go through each panelist and get some introductory remarks about our topic for today. Roger Stahl.
Well, thanks, Mickey. And thanks for setting all of this up, or being a part of it, MEF, all the panelists. I'm so grateful that we are having this conversation. So you talked about, kind of the general framework of the film and this relationship between the Pentagon and the entertainment industries, which I got interested in probably 15 years ago as I was working on some other things. And I'd always known about this relationship. It seemed significant in a sense, but scholars knew almost next to nothing about it. And there was no real critical work being done, no real effort at gathering documents primary documents that would give us details as to how this relationship worked. So most scholars just assumed 100 or 200 films had been subject to this relationship. Maybe there were script rewrites. We didn't know what they were. We didn't know really the breadth and the significance of all of this. And all that changed in 2017 when a couple of British researchers, a freelance journalist, and also a professor at the University of Bath, Tom Secker and Matt Alford, just decided to do those FOIA requests, and they gathered approximately 3,000 pages of weekly activity reports that described day-to-day kind of activities in the various branches, the Army, Navy, and Marines, Air Force, and the kinds of projects that they were working on. And suddenly the picture of the breadth of and the kinds of things that the military was working on in Hollywood and the broader entertainment industry just blew up. And that's what caught my attention. I was working on something else at the time, my second book. And I started consulting with them. And we were off to the races. And, you know, from that point to where we are now, the number of documents has grown from approximately 2,000 to 3,000 to about 60,000. And so new archives have opened up, FOIA requests have come to fruition, and now we have just a beautiful archive that was the basis for the film, and also is going to be the basis of what I hope will be the first critical, real critical history of this office. So that's my kind of nutshell. How did we get here story?
Fantastic, Roger. Let's go to you, Robin. Robin Anderson, you're in the film. So let's talk a little bit about your connection to it to kick things off.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Roger for this amazing film. It's just such a trove of documentation. The way that you've taken these pieces of paper that you've dug out of archives, through just tenacious work and dogged research, and you bring them up and you tie them to the images of the film and explain to the audience, this is a film that did get made, but this is the changes it had to go through. It had to eliminate anything about war crimes. It had to eliminate anything about sexism. No suicide attempts on the part of vets, all of that stuff. But then the list of films that didn't get made. And just the extent of the Pentagon's influence into Hollywood is really terrific. And it's really eye-opening, I think, for everybody who watches it. In terms of the films, Roger and I talked when you interviewed me, Roger, about Captain Marvel, and we saw a little bit of Captain Marvel on the film. But what I had talked about with you is the way that film was a blockbuster superhero film, and the Air Force adopted it as an advertising recruit. They had flyovers when the film had an opening, and they really equated Captain Marvel to your average Air Force flyer, and jet pilot. Of course, there's a tiny minority of women who are jet pilots, but you get these soldiers in these short videos saying, "She's one of us. She's a flyer," and so that recruitment element was really powerful, and the trove of the film just makes me think of how long we've been living in this audiovisual and ethos of militarism kind of culture that now has to dominate in many ways our audiovisual environment. And I think what we've really come to is a culture of militarism. I thought that Roger Stone's appearance was so terrific, and when Roger was talking about this is lies and propaganda, or however you want to say it, but it's what came through to Roger was the benevolence of any military operation, any soldier, the hierarchical command, and he says, but that's just not right. We have to call out evil when we see it. And certainly the celebration of the weapons of war that we see on these films, we have to always remember and bring ourselves back to the fact that these weapons of war are about killing people. They're about murder. They're about what we see now. They're about massive bombs in civilian neighborhoods, as we've seen in Gaza. And I'd like to make some further connections maybe later on about that ethos of militarism. I think that has a lot to do with our coverage of what's happening in Gaza.
Indeed. Robin, were you referencing Oliver Stone?
Oliver Stone. Who did I say?
You said Roger.
Roger Stone. Darn it. Oliver Stone. Yes. Thank you, Mickey.
Wrong Stone. I just wanted to point that out because there's a big difference between Roger Stone and Oliver Stone.
Yeah.
But anyway, and of course the difference between them and Roger Stahl, who is here with us. But Robin,
yes, that's probably where I got Roger Stone.
So, but Robin, we're looking forward to hearing more from you. And again, your appearance in the film was great, and you had a lot to offer. So it was great to see you in the film. FATOOMA SAAD, let's go to you. And you have a really unique background to address this issue. In addition to being a communications scholar, you're also a military veteran. So FATOOMA.
Thank you, Mickey. So, I mean, like you said when you introduced us all, part of my guiding ethos in doing this kind of research and this kind of work is that I believe that the military, the Department of Defense, should be accessible to everybody, not just the people that serve. And there is very much a big fog of ambiguity that surrounds the military. Questioning the military in any way is often, perceived as being anti-patriotic. So who better to question those actions than somebody that's worn the uniform? So that's kind of how I fell into examining, the actions of the military. To this point, I've done a lot of research centered around work-life conflicts and experiences of military families with military policies. But what really interests me about the media piece is how not just the militarization, the military itself is portrayed, but how veterans are portrayed. My husband and I are both arguing to take a lot of issue with the way that veterans are often portrayed in pop culture. So we joke that there's 3 boxes that they like to fit us in. We're either this unattainable standard of perfection, we are homeless under a bridge with a cardboard box, or we're vigilante killers like the Punisher, right? And there's really no other categories that veterans are often placed in. The same thing with films that show military life or alleged military life. So we're talking about the Captain Marvels, the Top Guns, the Midways, the Lone Survivor. Anybody that's worn the uniform will tell you that that's a lot of smoke and flare from Hollywood, because military life is often very dull. There's a whole lot of sitting around and doing nothing. And as somebody that did public affairs for the military as an active duty service member, my job was to make the military look sexy, for lack of a better term, right? And that's what Hollywood filmmakers are employed to do, make the military look as sexy as possible to non-military members for the purpose of either recruitment or as part of, in connection to their more overarching goal of winning hearts and minds. That's a military term of, how do we convince the public to spend $860+ billion and growing on this massive social institution. The way that they do that is by, coming into our homes, coming onto our phones, and portraying the military as positively or as sexy as they can to bring viewers in. And so those framing questions are what really interests me about military portrayals in Hollywood.
Thanks, FATOOMA. And MNAR ADLEY, MintPress News, you're the editor-in-chief, and you're a journalist. And so part of what you and your organization do, of course, is investigative reporting. And you've done you and your senior writer, Alan McLeod, have actually done a lot of in-depth investigation on the collusion, the connections between the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, big tech, Hollywood, etc. But MNAR ADLEY, let's have your opening remarks. Thank you again so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, everybody, for having me here. It's an honor to be here. And MintPress has reported on this treasure trove of documents that was released through these Freedom of Information requests. But my specific interest in covering this issue of, looking at the intersection between the national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, and mass media, and the entertainment industry, and how the establishment manufactures consent for war, really is rooted in my childhood. As an American, as a Palestinian, I did live under Israeli occupation and apartheid as a preteen for about 4 years. And so by 13 years old, I had already witnessed grave human rights abuses being committed by a state that had convinced the world that it was a civilized democracy. And by 13, I had already witnessed Palestinians being subjected to discriminatory laws, having their travel controlled, and having lived behind a 30-foot tall concrete apartheid wall separating us from the rest of the world. And so I lived under war. I had seen with my own eyes war jets drop bombs on homes in Ramallah, turning them to dust, to rubble. I lived under militarized curfews. I've had our water cut off, and I watched my family and our neighbors barricade their homes after threats of Israeli settler attacks. I've watched IDF soldiers bulldoze Palestinian homes, kick them out of their homes, cross through militarized checkpoints. My own aunt, who was a principal at the time when we were in Palestine, had bombs planted at her all-girl elementary school by Israeli settlers. And so the catalyst in my story, though, was really not that, but it was when I had moved back to the United States right before 9/11, and I was completely traumatized, and I had suffered from PTSD and anxiety and survivor's guilt, similar to what a lot of soldiers suffer from when they return home from war. And only to find the media outlets like CNN and MSNBC giving Israeli leaders and political figures paid for by the millions of dollars by Israeli lobby groups unlimited airtime on their networks and on the newspapers of the New York Times and the Washington Post to spew dehumanizing rhetoric about Palestinians and how we hated ourselves and that we wanted our children to die. And they basically created this like jihad, caricature of the way Muslims lived, and that we needed to be liberated. We needed democracy. A woman wearing the hijab was oppressed and abused by her husband. She wasn't an independent thinker, and she needed saving. And so it was after 9/11 that I witnessed the media beating the drums of war and bombarding us as Americans with images of women in Afghanistan wearing burqas, saying that they needed to be saved. I remember the show 24 was really popular, and it was commonly showing, each episode was like, trying to solve like a terror plot and protect people from, Muslims attacking America. And then there was like movies like American Sniper, the film that follows the life of Chris Kyle, who became the deadliest, marksman in U.S. military history with 255 kills. And he was memorialized through this film that was produced by and directed by Clint Eastwood. And so all of this I was experiencing and witnessing at the young age of 13 years old. And I was completely just, I don't want to say enamored, but just like, wow, this is how media propaganda works. Most kids at 13 weren't thinking about that, but I was. And so from there on, I decided to pursue journalism, and at 24 started MintPress. And since then, for over a decade, we have been one of the leading independent media outlets to uncover this kind of connection between the CIA, the Pentagon, the national security state, and the mass media industry, including entertainment. And so that's where, that's how I got to where I was today. We now know that the U.S. military basically rewrites major Hollywood blockbusters if they don't fit with its pro-war propaganda or if it damages its reputation. And FATOOMA had mentioned that, the job of Hollywood is to make the military look sexy. And that's really what we've learned through this treasure trove of documents. Young people are being groomed to like the military. Young people and Americans en masse are basically, we're being propagandized to manufacture, for us to approve of these forever wars. They're never presented through the lens of money-making mechanisms for, defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, the big weapons manufacturers, excuse me. They're always presented in general conflicts are presented through the lens of religion, or it's too complicated. And it's really never about the money-making mechanisms. And we see this through films like you mentioned, Mickey, Argo, Zero Dark 30, but it's also prevalent on like mainstream shows like Oprah and America's Got Talent. And we joked the other day, like they're probably even doing something with SpongeBob, you know, for little kids. I wouldn't be surprised. And the movie Transformer, James Bond, Marvel and DC Cinematic Universes, Hulk, for example, Top Gun. Something that, and I'll wrap up with this, something that we uncovered a lot about is the Pentagon's and the military's relationship with Call of Duty. You know, Call of Duty is one of the most popular military games, and you know, breaking records within 10 days of its new game. It earned over $1 billion in revenue. And the game, one of the games opens up with the person playing the game with a mission that was going to include assassinating an Iranian general, clearly based on Qasem Soleimani, a statesman and military leader slain by the Trump administration in 2020. And so these are the kinds of things that these movies or these games push and frame, and this is part of the grooming of the young crowd. And then Call of Duty is actually owned by an entertainment organization called Activision Blizzard, and part of their key staff and connections to state power include directly the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense. They've basically infiltrated Activision Blizzard. And so most of the most popular video games that our children are playing, that most teenagers in this country are playing, are being programmed directly by the national security state. And so I had my, I guess you could say, conscious awakening at 13, but it wouldn't have been possible with that very traumatizing experience, living under occupation, living under war, living under the war machine. You know, Israel today represents just this proxy state that fuels the military industrial complex. I mean, look what they're doing to Gaza today. They are openly committing genocide. They are committing war crime after war crime. And we have our politicians from the Democratic Party who are putting big smiles on their faces and pretending to care about human rights while they hand the very bombs to the state of Israel to use against the civilian population in Gaza. And we're not seeing Hamas being bombed or defeated or being killed. We're openly seeing on our smartphones and on our TVs, civilians, children. I mean, what is it? Over 30,000 people have been killed, and you know, over 12,000 children, over 5,000 babies. I mean, we can't call that collateral damage. This is, you know, all of these wars, and this war specifically with the war in Gaza, it's again being presented through this Hamas versus Israel war. It started on October 7th. You know, we're being presented with very, you know, unverified claims of rape on October 7th, and all of these things that have been debunked time and time again. And yet the media keeps pushing these things. I mean, the media today that we have, and I'll wrap up with this, I know I'm going on for longer than I probably should, but the New York Times, the so-called paper of record, is the one that has been perpetuating and pushing so much fake news about Palestine and Gaza in this crisis. And so all of these media organizations should be held accountable, but they're not. They're given just all of this funding, all of this access to people, all the algorithms support these corporate media outlets to just push the propaganda openly on social media, while independent media outlets and independent journalists are being smeared, they're being attacked, and the algorithms just don't work in our favor while they do work in their favor, so that dominant propaganda remains dominant. And sometimes it's even pushed through soft propaganda. And so we have to really be careful of that. And that's something that MintPress has been leading the way of exposing.
MNAR ADLEY, MintPress News, thanks so much for your opening remarks and sharing those, sharing them with us. Roger Stahl, let's go round two. And I am mindful of the clock. And when we get up to the top of the hour, I definitely want to make sure that we're segueing into comments, into Q&A, and want to bring in all the folks that have been coming here to watch. There's over 60 people, so I definitely want to make sure that we get to you all. Roger, there's a lot that came up in the first round. We're going to start the second round here. And I know Robin Anderson has written extensively, actually, about debunking the New York Times rape case and so forth. But let's go back to the normalization of all of this and theaters of war, Roger Stahl. Often we see popular culture as innocuous, and we see, oh, it's just a game, or it's just a show, or it's a movie. But that's really, that kind of propaganda is what really gets into people. And that's the kind of thing that really normalizes this. It's not just the overt beating of the head that we see in the propaganda in the so-called news. It's the various kinds we see across the spectrum. And, you know, one of our audience members, Rob Williams, wrote a chapter for us over 10 years ago called Screening the Homeland about Argo and Zero Dark 30. You know, there's a great example, and I know you mentioned it, Roger, too, and it's in the film, where Michelle Obama was actually satellite feed into the Academy Awards to give an Oscar for Argo. And she said, every day our children learn to open their imagination, to dream just a little bit bigger. I want to thank all of you tonight for being part of that vitally important work. Well, that vitally important work was the propaganda of the military entertainment complex, and they were being given accolades from the First Lady of the United States, which is pretty remarkable, right? I remember when that was happening, I was like, wait, what just happened? And perhaps I'm more attuned to that kind of thing to ask critical questions of that. But Roger, this relationship is not new between the Pentagon, the CIA, Hollywood entertainment firms, et cetera. And it goes back a long way. And you talk about that in the film. And certainly since 9/11, the infamous meeting of Hollywood execs in the Beverly Hill Hotel that I know you'll be talking about in a future project. Well, let's maybe get into some more details, and let's talk about some of these, maybe highlight a few of the things that stand out in your mind from Theaters of War. Roger Stahl.
Well, yeah, that Michelle Obama moment was really special. I mean, there was a period when those offices at the Pentagon were experimenting with being more public. So, you know, Zero Dark 30, Argo, these were what were being called at the time Washington movies, because the controversy around government support for these had gone public. And a lot of the pressure was coming from the right, because, you know, they were trying to cast aspersions on the Obama administration, but they, you know, played a big role in opening up a lot of the documents for those particular films. And then, of course, the Academy Awards rolled around for Argo, and Michelle Obama's up on the big screen. And when I first sat down with Oliver Stone, that was the first thing out of his mouth. He's like, I couldn't believe it, you know, sitting there in the audience, you know, and we're going to celebrate Best Picture. And there's, you know, this film that I know was supported by the White House and the CIA, and he knew this because it had been public at that time. We didn't know the details of the script changes, but the relationship was, and I couldn't believe it. Yeah, you had the same experience apparently at the same time. You know, the things that stick out with this relationship for me are just the you know, 3 or 4 pages that will come down the pike of specific changes that they want to make to scripts. And, you know, Robin did a very nice job of listing the kinds of things that in the Pentagon they would call showstoppers. These are the, you know, non-starters, things that will get you canceled if you don't change them. They will just deny Pentagon support and take away all their toys if you don't change these specific things in the script. And they include things like torture and sexual harassment in the military, racism, war crimes, stuff like that. You know, reading about that and, you know, those kinds of comments in the script notes that a typical publication will get comprise maybe 20% of the notes that will come from the Pentagon, and the rest are, you know, technical matters that I don't think most of us would have a problem with. But then there's this 20% that are really PR pay dirt for the military. They're the things that would really have an effect on public opinion, depending on who sort of wins in that struggle over the script. You know, just kind of compiling that list of showstoppers is real revelation. But, you know, the really weird, you know, part of this surprising thing is that it's not just war movies, and it's not just fantasy movies and comic book movies like Iron Man. You know, MNAR, I think you mentioned that, you know, there are talk shows and cooking shows, and, you know, home renovation shows and reality TV has become a huge channel for them to get across their message. So, to think about like to kind of corral this and categorize this as a war film issue is really, I think, mistaken. Maybe that's 10 to 20% of what they do. And then 80% is video games, reality TV, fantasy, comic book movies. They're doing talk shows and filling the audience with service members and doing shout outs at the Super Bowl. And, it's the full spectrum of entertainment activity. They don't leave anything off the table. And so that's another one of the surprising things for me. I have a feeling your question was about like, what do you see in those script change requests that really got to you? If there's time, I can come back to that.
Yeah, those are very important details, Roger. And again, as you point out in the film, you say that they've always had their toe in sci-fi, but now it's a major part of the game. Once you've conquered fantasy, where do you go? Reality, of course. And you go on to say that the Pentagon has staked a flag in every little strange corner of reality TV, from game shows like The Price is Right, cooking shows. Like I was just, just quipping a moment ago in the chat, they're baking the propaganda right into the cake. The places where you don't expect it. NFL looks more brazen and in your face. But it's all over the place, Roger. It's hard, it's ubiquitous. It's hard it's hard to be shielded from the reach of this propaganda.
Yeah, and we tend to think of propaganda as, poster printing and perhaps government sponsorship or the production of short films or something like that. And that is the way it used to work. But now they realize that people have their defenses up and their radar up, and they are not, they're not looking for government messages embedded in popular fare, like game shows and talk shows and even war movies, video games, as MNAR pointed out with Call of Duty. They're not looking for that message to show up in those media, and so it becomes a Trojan horse and a really effective way of getting underneath the radar and smuggling that message in.
So Robin Anderson, let's go to you again and add to what we were just talking about. Maybe you have another couple examples, and you may also, I know we're straddling the world of entertainment, infotainment, and then of course MNAR as our panelist, as well as you, Robin. You're a media studies scholar and a journalist. MNAR is a journalist. And of course, FATOOMA's a media studies scholar, comm scholar. So we're coming at this from similar angles, but also the journalistic one keeps coming up. And I know you may have some things to add to that, given your recent work and your recent publications. But Robin Anderson.
Thanks, Mickey. Thank you, Mickey. Going back to Argo, I think what was fascinating about that film, I wrote a piece for FAIR that compared Zero Dark 30, a very short piece, to Argo, because both were up for the Academy Award at the same time. Argo was kind of this fun, happy, feel-good movie that portrayed an American CIA agent getting the hostages released. It wasn't an American CIA, it was a Canadian CIA agent. They did the heavy lifting on that. And of course, there was the dramatic airport scene, on the tarmac runway that never happened. And Zero Dark 30, which had to go through a very heavy scrutinization because they don't like to talk about torture. But what she did is go overboard, and she portrayed torture as effective information gathering, where they actually found Osama bin Laden through torturing someone. And of course, that never happened. It's a complete invention. So these are ways they build into these myths, confirming with these powerful narratives our heroism, United States heroism, the evil terrorists. And after so many decades of this, Roger, I love in the movie where Roger talks about how it kind of changes and escalates over time. In the mid-'80s, they changed a little bit, and in the mid-'90s. And they went from just a little public relations to recruiting, and then really forcefully making the military look good. And Fatima, you talked about how that this propaganda is a very sexy way to do it. It's a very entertainment way to do it. You take the weaponry and you celebrate it, and the pilots that are in the airplanes, they're the most powerful men on earth because they're the ones that control and are using this weaponry, and they're such professional soldiers, and they're and then they're celebrated as heroes, and the snipers and stuff. And because we never see what's on the ground, that's hidden from us. We don't think that these weapons are actually killing people all the time around the world now. And in terms of that kind of entertainment and military ethos, after all of these years, making the Air Force look like rock and roll stars, they've actually said that, but also making it justifying. Roger, was really great. Whether we explained that they justified this censorship and manipulation of scripts to make it more accurate. They just say, well, you entertainment people, you don't know how to make a film. You don't know what the military looks like. And we're here to tell you, so we're going to be more accurate. Well, accuracy is right out the window with all of the stuff that, these are space aliens oftentimes that we're battling against, and things like that. But accuracy can't be part of the military's project when there's an entire list of things you can't talk about. In terms of how this audiovisual milieu over all of these decades of military dominance in Hollywood blockbuster films, the films that get okayed, they're not really works of art. They're not your normal fictional characterizations where characters develop. They don't have a lot of nuance. They don't have a lot of complexity. You've got your good and bad. You've got your enemies and your good soldiers. And the enemies that we're used to thinking about our enemies in the caricatures that are presented in Hollywood films. And it makes it so much easier to demonize and dehumanize what we identify as our enemies now in real life, and the audiovisual milieu and the ethos of the military goes across media as it's so convergent now. And so we move from films, and then we have the same thing in news reporting, and then we have the same thing when we're actually talking about real enemies and war. So you can demonize Hamas, you can say they did all of this stuff, because we're not told what they're saying, what they're doing, and this attack came from nowhere. And MNAR gave us the context of what it was like to live under military occupation and apartheid under Israel for the Palestinians. All of that is knocked out when these people are simply evil terrorists, and that we must crush them with our weapons. And that really is the message of the ethos of Hollywood. And the Israelis, they're the ones that they are our proxies, and they're the ones that are the good guys, and so we don't have to question them, and we in fact don't question them because they've got the power. Finally, I'd like to say that with not talking about the complexities of international conflict, and they say that war is the result of failed diplomacy and it's failed politics. We don't have any of that. These decades of these types of films that don't give you any real portrayals, not only of the people in the military, but the military themselves, their hierarchies, their decision-making, their policy-making, and the effects that they have on global diplomacy. And therefore we have no discussion. We have no discussion or words or language to even talk about peace or negotiations for a ceasefire or anything like that, because we don't talk about war crimes and illegal weapon sales. Illegal weapons are not part of those, are on the list of things directly that have been taken out of films. And so the American media simply doesn't talk about war crimes that the Israelis are doing. And that's the connection, I think, between the great content in this film and what we've been seeing in the portrayals in media and news reporting about what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, from on screen to off screen, right? And that we see the propaganda on screen, right? Then off screen becomes the on screen of the news, what's being shown, what isn't, what we're primed to accept, right? Versus the narratives and the voices we don't see, right? There's a lot of the worthy and unworthy victims narrative going on, both in Hollywood and the corporate media in the West, for sure. FATOOMA SAAD, there's certainly a lot more that I know you can add here. And we're also interested in the fact that you have a military background and you used to do some communications work there. So I know you have some things that you want to add to the conversation, FATOOMA. So let's hear from you now.
Thanks, Mickey. In 2024, I now call what I did propaganda, because that's exactly what it was, right? So first,
Yeah.
I want to thank Robin and MNAR for for bringing to our attention the horrific crimes that are happening in Gaza right now. And a lot of us have been, glued to our phones, right, for 5 months, wondering why other people can't see what we see. But if we stop and we think critically about why other people cannot see or humanize the Palestinian experience, it's not too hard to understand when we've been conditioned from a very young age. And I know that we've talked about some more recent films like the Top Guns, the Captain Marvels, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but military propaganda has been going on well before World War II, but really became solidified during World War II. Walt Disney World Studios was making propaganda for children during World War II, right? So we have to ask ourselves whose interests are being served here. So when you look at some of our favorite childhood films that maybe like as a 5 or 6 or 10-year-old, you're not conditioned to question, why do all the bad guys have hooked noses? Why do all the bad guys have thick accents, but the princesses and princess don't? We're being conditioned to other people that don't have Western features, that might be villains in the military industrial complex, greater narrative. We saw recently with Aaron Bushnell, who sacrificed his life to bring attention to what's going on in Palestine. And as soon as that story broke, many of us in the veteran community said, well, we're just waiting for the DoD to put out a statement that it was a mental health crisis, rather than acknowledging and using the words that he chose to use in those final moments. Iron Man 2 was a clear example of whose interests are being served. The whole premise of the Iron Man film is that Tony Stark is a defense contractor. But nobody ever thinks defense contractor bad. Lockheed Martin is bad. Boeing is bad. All these weapons manufacturers are bad. No, we're taught to treat them as heroes. The Avengers save the universe from these crazy aliens that are out there. What's really interesting to me, though, as somebody that did this for a living in the military, when we're asking ourselves whose interests are being served, I think first we have to recognize that it's not the U.S. troops. The troops themselves are not the ones that are benefiting from this kind of narrative. Really, an attack on military troops, I've always felt, is an attack on poverty in the middle class, because who does the military recruit from? They recruit from families whose children could not otherwise afford to go to college, could not otherwise afford healthcare, could not otherwise afford these career opportunities. But we're serving the interests, these stories are serving the interests of the military industrial complex, of the war machine, of the people that profit off of war, off of military intervention, off of U.S. foreign policy. The current and the former heads of the film liaison office at the DoD were both public affairs specialists. They both did the same job that I did while they were in the military. And so when I reflect on my own service as somebody that did, and I'll put it in big air quotes, public affairs for the military, which amounts to propaganda, we are given stories of, Bill Ganaust, who was the Marine cameraman that captured the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, and then the civilian counterpart, Joe Rosenthal, who won the Pulitzer Prize for that photograph. We're not so much informed about the John Fords and the Frank Capras that are working behind the scenes on the Hollywood end, shaping the narrative of public perception when it comes to military involvement. So I think that the pervasive nature of that relationship is so multi-layered. It doesn't just impact those of us that are viewing the films on the outside, but it impacts those that are in uniform, that are having to live with the consequences of those narratives painted for them. Having been on the outside now more years than I was in, I'm the first to say Hollywood is bad for veterans. Hollywood is bad for veterans. Hollywood is bad for positive military change, whether it be combating sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military, whether it be combating issues related to gender inclusion, whether it be related to family-related policies. The Hollywood portrayals of the military are really bad for sustainable growth in the military and for the veteran community.
Thanks, Fatooma. MNAR, let's go to you for the conclusion of the second round, and we want to talk about a little bit more in a moment about what we can do about these things. And there are already a number of fantastic questions and comments that we also wish to address here. So I'm mindful of the clock. So MNAR, could you add for a few minutes here, you want to add something for the second round, some other things that you're thinking about after listening to the other panelists?
I think the biggest thing, I said what I said. I think I covered a lot. And I appreciate what everybody else added. I think the biggest thing that we have to remember is that we are living in an information war. We're living in a media no-fly zone, I guess you could say, where online censorship has become the new norm. And so for the past decade, we have been kind of raising the alarm about how this intersection is just getting closer and closer and closer. And actually, it's becoming more apparent. It's not even soft propaganda anymore. It's in everything that we see, hear, and read online. We are surrounded by propaganda more than ever before. And it's happening apart from, the entertainment industry and within the newspapers. I think we really have to be fearful of the way that it works within the algorithms on social media and the way that certain narratives are being pushed. And we're seeing that with the war in Ukraine, this upcoming, this Cold War that the media has been pushing and the establishment has been pushing with Russia, with Iran, with China. So we really have to be careful in the way that the media and the algorithms work to push certain narratives forward and to keep these pro-war narratives dominant, because, people can turn off their TV, but most people are accessing information online through their smartphones, through these social media platforms. It's really easy for us to sit here and say, okay, well, we can all just stop using Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and let's all migrate to this other, free speech platform. But the truth is that the majority of the world's population is not making that move. They are in mass using these big tech platforms that are run by Silicon Valley and that are being advised and infiltrated by people that work for the CIA directly, work for the Pentagon, that work for defense contractors, and they're making the decisions to ensure that pro-war narratives are dominant. And so this really frightens me because they're advancing in a way that could make independent journalism and independent and alternative outlets and kind of information completely disappear from online spaces. And we're seeing that through online flagging systems like NewsGuard. I don't know if anybody really knows much about NewsGuard, but they're an online rating system that is founded and run and directed by the very same people that brought us the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They were the ones that worked with the Bush administration and people that had advised Obama on Syria, for example. These are the people, like Richard Engel, for example. These are the people that have founded NewsGuard, and their rating now media outlets. And of course, they've given every single corporate media outlet a green check mark. And they've given pretty much all of the independent media outlets X's and made them appear and frame them as being, you know, cause of suspicion. And mostly it's because they're anti-war and they're covering the war machine and the military industrial complex, and they're reporting accurately about the profiteers of the war machine. And so the reason why this is really concerning is because things like NewsGuard, at first it's like, okay, it's just a rating system, you can pick and choose, we're going to allow people to pick and choose what they want to read and not read, or click on or not click on. But this is being integrated within Microsoft devices. It's already been integrated across all libraries in the state of Hawaii. And if somebody sees a big X warning sign and there's a warning, this website is not, you know, trusted, people are not going to click on that website. And so this is, but if they get the green check mark, they're going to click on it. And then also NewsGuard is advancing their agenda by, if a website gets an X check mark or an X warning sign label, they are actually going to be using that to prevent these websites from receiving any sort of funding and revenue. And so it's a really sadistic kind of way that's being worked in the background to target independent and alternative media outlets and people and information. And so I do see that this information war is being escalated in the background on so many different levels, but it's slow acting, where they introduce certain things to kind of see the reaction of people, and they present it in a way where it's like, oh, we're just trying to you know, help people with media literacy, except these are the same people and organizations and institutions that the media should actually be holding accountable, and yet they are the ones in charge of controlling the narrative and controlling the free flow of information. And so we're already seeing this being launched in states like Hawaii, and I think that this is going to be expanded through more libraries and Microsoft devices across the country. So just something to be aware of, where this information war is kind of headed towards, and it's in its next phase.
Thanks so much, MNAR ADLEY, MintPress News, and thanks to all of our panelists. We were hoping to do another round that focused specifically on solutions, but what I'm going to do in the interest of time is merge some of this stuff together. I want to merge some talk about things we can do about this with the many questions and comments that folks have been sending in the whole time we've been talking. So I want to be mindful of that. So propaganda and censorship are often two sides of the same coin. MNAR, thank you so much for bringing in the efforts that are oftentimes some of the things that we see in our society that claim that they want to fight so-called fake news or fight the disinformation war, but the things that they're doing about it have nothing to do with really getting to the root of the truth of something, but rather to simply propagate another perspective or to officialize a certain narrative while suppressing others. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And again, let's go through and start doing a little bit of the Q&A and commentary, but also, if possible, I would like to ask each of our panelists to focus on what we can do about this kind of propaganda that Roger Stahl focuses on in film theaters of war. What are some solutions that we might apply, like more critical media literacy education, support for independent journalism and filmmakers, support for independent artists, being the media, encouraging people to create their own kinds of content? There's a lot of things we can do, and maybe some of that will come up now while we hear from our from all of our audience. So again, thanks so much to all of our expert panelists. And again, things keep pouring in. So let's start here. We have several things, a couple of questions that touched on this topic, and maybe some of you can address this. We've heard the panelists talking about how Hollywood openly collaborates with Pentagon and so on. But what happens when Hollywood films about the war and the military? What happens when the Pentagon doesn't like these? How does the military PR machine respond? to maybe the infrequent films critical of U.S. foreign policy, maybe some of them made by people like Oliver Stone. So Roger Stahl, maybe we can start with you. I think you did foreshadow and tease us a bit with so-called showstoppers, as they're called. Roger Stahl.
Yeah, well, if a filmmaker approaches the Pentagon and asks for help and refuses to make the changes that the Pentagon or the CIA, but mostly the Pentagon, asks for, then they will be denied support, and this increases the cost of making the film, and it might mean that you will lose studio support for making that film, and the film will never be made. That happens. If you do have studio support, then the film will be made anyway, and the Pentagon just sort of grits its teeth and you know, maybe second guesses itself. We see evidence in the documentation. They sometimes say, well, maybe we should have given a little support so we could have had a little leverage, even if we don't overall like this script. But for the most part, they have to live with that, because they won't in every case be able to extend their reach into that production and influence in the way they want. We see evidence that you know, they are very keen in keeping an eye on films that represent the military that don't approach the Pentagon for support. So they keep a list in the outreach section of these documents saying, well, this film is being made about an outpost in Afghanistan, and they haven't come to us yet. We hope they will. Let's send somebody to that production office and offer support and see what they say. So they're constantly like reaching out and you know, being kind of proactive about this, in order to kind of gain some leverage over productions. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But you know, for the most part, you know, in answering that question, you're at a disadvantage as a filmmaker without Pentagon support, and that shows up in the bottom line. And since it's a business, Hollywood's a business, and because you know, executives at Paramount or other studios are thinking, you know, what are the box office receipts versus, you know, the cost of production. The Pentagon can tilt those numbers in its favor, and use that as a very persuasive appeal, and that's the way it goes down.
Any of our other panelists want to address that issue before we go to the next question comment? Okay. You know, a fascinating question, a couple questions and comments. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I didn't have my mic on, but I would like to make a comment about.
Please do.
In the early 2000s, there and into the teens, there were some very good films made about the struggles that vets were going through, and some other critical films. The way the Pentagon deals with those is they haven't funded them. They're not blockbusters film. They don't have a lot of marketing money. They remain in small distribution, and so they're just not seen. And I would add that there are have been some good films out there. And I'd like to put in a link because in a special edited version of the Democratic Communique, which is the Union for Democratic Communications that I did with Tanner Mirlis, there were some very good people are asking about film reviews. There were good film reviews, and there was a very good chapter on these small films and how good they were, but how few people saw them.
Can I give a couple of examples, Mickey? Because I think people are hungry for examples. At this point, I've been talking in generalities for a while. But one is from the film, and one is one that didn't make it into the film, which I really like, and I'll talk about that one first. In the early 80s, everybody's familiar with the film Red Dawn, right? The Ruskies land, they shoot up a school, the kids fight them off. It's a ridiculous film by John Milius. John Milius, what's his name? Milius. Milius. That film received help from the Pentagon and was very successful. There was another film that was produced at the same time, they tried to produce it, called, oh gosh, I should have the name. It was about the military liaison missions. It was called Recovery. And that film did not get made. And you ask, like, what are the U.S. military liaison missions? Well, it was a program of spy training that the U.S. had with the USSR. And it was during the height of the Cold War, the late 70s, when tensions were at their highest. And we allowed Russian spies to come over to the West and stay at embassies and observe things, and the Soviets did the same. The entry for recovery and why the Pentagon denied it said, we simply do not want to make a film about the U.S. military liaison missions. And this was in the early 80s when they're trying to ramp up tensions, when there was an arms race. And, you know, this was a story about thawing those ice cold tensions at the time. And that just wasn't conducive to ramping up military spending and military activity around the world. So they denied that one, and it didn't get made. So we know about Red Dawn, which demonizes the Russians. We don't know about Recovery, which is a story about how we could make it work, or how we were making it work. And that has a direct effect on public perceptions of what the Cold War was all about. So we don't know anything about the U.S. military liaison missions to this day, in part because film hasn't been made about it. The other example was the Hunt for Red October, and the production house that was in charge of that was Paramount. That was the first in the series of Jack Ryan movies. Kind of kicked things off. This was a Tom Clancy series, and the producer, his name, gosh, what was his name? It'll come to me. The producer of that film went to Paramount and said, I've got this great script. It happened to be Ronald Reagan's favorite book. Can I make this movie? And Paramount straight up told him, it's going to cost a lot to make, representations of these submarines. You better get Pentagon help. And if you don't, we can't make the film. And the producer said, oh, okay, I'll try my best. But that agreement was in the contract that Paramount wrote up for the filmmakers. You get Pentagon help, or this film is not going to get produced. And unfortunately, the Pentagon loved that script, and they allowed them full use of all this kind of military equipment, including submarines, helicopters, and that film was made. But that's an example of a film, and there are many others that just simply wouldn't have been made contractually if Pentagon approval hadn't been gotten first.
FATOOMA?
I was just gonna piggyback off of what Roger said, and I think this touches on one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A. One thing that came to mind, as Roger was describing that process, is the term mutually exploitive. It's a term that Phil Strub, who served as the head of the Film Liaison Office for 29 years, has often used to describe the relationship between the military and, by proxy, the CIA and Hollywood. And it's one that a lot of scholars that have, really delved into this topic have used, the mutually exploitive relationship, in that the military gets final say on the narratives that are written and filmed and, disseminated to the masses about them. And in exchange, Hollywood filmmakers or game makers or music video makers, whoever, get access to billions and billions of dollars of U.S. assets. I mean, otherwise it would be impossible for most filmmakers to produce the films that they do without U.S. military support. And so that term, that framing of that relationship as mutually exploitive has been very interesting to me, because both sides get something out of it. I mean, the military obviously gets a little bit more because it's their story being told, but just wanted to add that on.
Mutually beneficial might be a better phrase for it. I mean, that seems like a public relations coinage right there. The real exploited party is the American people.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I agree. Right. Absolutely. I mean, for Phil Strub to say mutually exploitive, it's almost like, hey, our arm is being twisted here. We really don't want to do this, but we are. I would definitely agree with that assessment, Roger, is that it's a mutually beneficial relationship with the American public at a loss. And not just the American public, but really anywhere where we export our media. Marvel films aren't just seen in American theaters and in American homes. We're influencing, as I said earlier, hearts and minds all over the planet.
That's right. And I think that from a First Amendment perspective, I've always thought that allowing the Pentagon to shape scripts is very much like prior restraint, and that's very illegal in our Constitution. of course, they get out of it by saying, well, you don't have to make the film. But it makes that content unavailable mostly from all of the films that were rejected and never made that Roger has documented in that film. And I continue to think there might be a First Amendment case there for prior restraint.
So there's a couple of questions, a couple of comments that, remark on the history of this practice. It didn't just start recently. It didn't start just after 9/11. We heard earlier in the panel discussion, allusions historically to this happening. And so there's past as prologue. And of course, it's important to go back. One of our attendees goes back through Turner Classic Movies, right? And of course, FATOOMA talked about World War II and Disney. Another attendee goes back further, and I'm always excited to hear when somebody talks about Eddie Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and his blueprint for propaganda in the book Propaganda, 1928, when that came out. Well, this influence on early Hollywood, early screen. I mean, this goes way back. Bernays, in fact, was part of the Creel Commission, the Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, an advertising person. And part of what they did was sell World War I to the public. And part of how they did it was by using what they called 4-minute men, where they had 75,000 volunteers working with the government, going around to movie houses as a popular form of entertainment. And it took 4 minutes to change the reels between films. And so this is a place that they would get up and speak to people and talk about demonizing the enemy. In this case, it was Germany, and it was part of a concerted effort. And so I see Bernays' fingerprints, at least indirectly, there. And again, to our panelists here, I am wearing the historian cap right now. And so I'm very interested in how there is a long history of this. And I think, as Roger and others have pointed out, I think it's gotten more sophisticated, more ubiquitous. But the more we become more media literate about how it works, I think it does become easier to detect. So comments from the panel on sort of the history of this and where we're going. You'll also see I'm trying to tease out some more solutions thinking among the panelists. So Roger, let's start with you.
Okay. I'd probably point our audience to books that have delved into the history of this to some degree. 2004, Operation Hollywood by David Robb, and then 2017, I mentioned these two before, Tom Secker and Matthew Alford's National Security Cinema, and Tom Secker's site, which is spyculture.com, which is a kind of a deep dive, a granular dive into a lot of the documents I've been referencing, a really great resource as well. But this relationship goes all the way back to the birth of film. So Birth of a Nation was supported by the Army at the time. It was 1915. And then, of course, you have the Creel Commission in World War I. You have another kind of official set of entities that pop up in World War II, the Office of War Information. But peacetime, these relationships continue. So you could look at this office, informally in the interwar years as an extension of the Creel Commission because they were involved in producing films. But it's a peacetime operation that gets set up kind of informally. After World War II, 1949 is when the office gets set up formally, and then it persists to this day as a peacetime entity. So, there are wartime entities and peacetime entities, and the film is about the peacetime entity, which has not received as much attention as the Creel Commission and the OWI. There's a lot of documentation on that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's been around for a long time. Bernays, being part of the Creel Commission, he's got his fingerprints on it. He really recognized, because of his Freudian influence, the power of narrative and emotional appeals. So when you're watching a film, you're not thinking about the kind of cognitive aspect of figuring out the gamesmanship or whatever you want to call it of combat. You're locked into an identification with a particular character and their story, and so it's this appealing on an emotional affective register that really gives the Pentagon a real advantage when dealing with Hollywood film versus other forms of propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Any other panelists want to weigh in on this before I move to the next?
Well, Edward Bernays was really one of the founders of modern media war propaganda during World War I. And speaking of the way he moved, these things move from one media to the next, that was mostly about censorship. And then, as Roger was talking about, he really knew how to create propaganda. But the 20th century was when we really started this propaganda, and Edward Bernays, and then he went into advertising. So he was a hugely important figure.
Absolutely. We have another one of our attendees. It's a little longer setup, but I think very important. So I want to make sure we get this in. One of our attendees writes, as an Indigenous person working in alternative media and co-hosting and producing an Indigenous public affairs program, radio program, issues pertaining to settler colonialism and Native American peoples and nations within the politically defined borders of the U.S. are almost always censored. When Native Americans are introduced, it's very tangential, and Native Americans are often treated as objects of interest. That said, how does everyone reimagine the critically important work they do by starting with settler colonialism and the relationship with Native American peoples and nations? This person is stating the question because much of what has been shared is a Westphalian approach to protecting the United States, despite its questionable and deplorable past and current practices that everyone insightfully critiqued and articulated. Anybody want to address this important issue? Any of the panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the relationship between what's going on now and settler colonialism in so many realms of the United States, from the legacy of slavery here to Israel's domination as they colonized Palestine, and as the American quote unquote pioneers came in and dominated the Indians. And I think that the point that we can really make is that this kind of genocide and this kind of demonization of what has often been called, or called, if you look at Joel Covell's work, the noble savages, and how Native Americans were discussed as savages, and also how, of course, Hamas and Palestinians are now discussed as savages. The dehumanization and the pushing out of this kind of embrace of our human family community, that makes it palatable for us to, for weapons and militarized culture, to justify the slaughter of those people. And you normally, hopefully, there's an idea that people in peaceful societies are against the mass murder of people. And it's precisely because you must demonize those people that propaganda exists to justify the actions of settler colonialism. We've seen it played out in so many different countries and so many different time frames historically, that this is definitely a pattern. And I would say that the connection there is the demonization and the putting, if you think of Thomas Friedman's horrible op-ed in the New York Times, that they're cockroaches and spiders and wasps, and those are the way that we justify killing masses of people.
So MNAR or FATOOMA, do you want to weigh in here at all? Nope.
Having lived in a post 9/11 world as a Muslim American woman who didn't wear the hijab, but wore the hijab at a, when I was like 19, 20 years old, we experienced that as Muslims when George Bush announced and launched his wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The way that those wars were justified and the way in which the media manufactured consent for that was through the dehumanization of Muslims, to paint Muslim women as needing to be saved, to paint Muslim men as barbaric, as savages, as backwards, as angry. And it was like on repeat over and over again. We were being bombarded with this messaging, and it basically, even the most not racist person or not most loving person, you would notice that they would start to have these ideas about what Muslim women were like. And so I felt like I had to kind of always be not on the defense, but always prove, have to prove that Muslim women were not oppressed, or the hijab is not oppressing, that I was strong and I was independent. And so it really pushed Muslims kind of into this corner where we had to prove that we were human, that we were just regular people. And so, but these kinds of framing and caricatures that were made of Muslims is not like a new concept. We were certainly not the first, but it helped justify the murder of over 2 million people from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And look at, Iraq now. It's the home of the biggest U.S. embassy in the world. It was one of the most profitable wars for oil companies, for people like Bush and Dick Cheney, and many of the architects of that war. I mean, they made so much money off of the dehumanization of the people and the death and destruction of that country. And look at Afghanistan, the dehumanization of the woman there. And while some of it was true, the context of the fact that it was our government and our country and our weapons and our money that was funding the Taliban was completely left out. We are the ones who created that scenario that perpetuated this kind of oppression towards women. And so I remember like in the early days of post 9/11, I was always kind of trying to show people that this was the true face of Islam, true face of, what being a Palestinian-American Arab woman was like. But this concept was used against, this kind of propaganda and dehumanization was used against Native Americans. It still is used against Native Americans. And it's really, really sad. And it's still used against African Americans, and it was used against Jewish people during the Holocaust to perpetuate anti-Semitism and hate for Jewish people. And we have to remember that, to solve the Jewish problem in Europe was to create, not to solve the Jewish problem, just to solve the anti-Semitism and hate towards Jewish people in Europe. They went to create, these European countries, along with the United States, went to create another problem, which is this colonialism and settler colonial state of Israel. And so it's a never-ending cycle. And the only way to end that cycle is, honestly, I believe it's to have those one-on-one, on-the-ground human interactions. I share this story often, but one of my, when I first moved into this home, hope my neighbor's not watching, but my neighbor, when I met him, he saw my boys in the front. My boys are very light-skinned. One of my boys has big blue-green eyes. You'd never think he was Middle Eastern, right? He doesn't have the typical Middle Eastern look. But so my neighbor asked him, "Oh, you guys are moved in here. What's your name?" He's like, "Oh, Muhammad." He's like, "Oh, what's your brother's name?" He's like, "Malik." And he just kind of looked at them like, "Oh, where are you guys from?" And then I come out and I start talking to my neighbor, and he said, "Oh, I didn't really know anything about Muslims until I watched the show 24. And so he was totally propagandized, and he had these preconceived notions about Muslims and terrorism, and, he had this fear in him. But just to long story short, because of my interactions with him and speaking with him and just, being kind and loving and embracing him, even though he did have that racism, he's been able to make that shift in his mind. And so that's really the only way that we can really embark on that change. Big tech giants, video game makers, the mass media industry, they want us addicted to our devices. And when we are addicted to our devices, we're getting dopamine rush after dopamine rush, and we are stuck on these devices. We're able to argue with people. We can block people. We're not actually forced to interact in this positive way with other people and to just see the humanity and the love and the connection that we can build. Instead, these addictions to technology, which of course there's a lot of benefits to technology, but in this context, it is there to keep us divided.
So I'm mindful of the clock, very important sentiments, and actually a great thing to have as we come near the conclusion. FATOOMA and Robin, I want to get you both in here because you want to weigh in, and then I'm going to need to move toward our conclusion because I see that it is 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, and I want to be respectful of everyone here, our panelists, sponsors, co-sponsors, and as well as the audience. It's clear that there's much more to say, and perhaps that occasions us to meet again. FATOOMA and then Robin, please. FATOOMA?
I think, yes, I think it was Larry's question that we were responding to, correct? About their indigenous work. And it was something that MNAR said that really struck me about humanizing that experience through personal interaction, personal communication, sharing our own stories. It made me think there weren't many times that, like, you know, as somebody in uniform, where I had to raise my eyebrows at how backwards people's thinking might be. I think I grew up kind of insulated in the Metro Detroit community. We're home to a lot of immigrant population, a lot of ethnic and religious diversity here. But I remember somebody asking me where I was from, and you know, I started to share my hometown, and he cut me off and he said, "I know where that is. That's where all the Muslims are," in a very condescending way. And I said, "Well, yes, my family immigrated here from Lebanon. My family are Muslim Americans," and you can almost see the color drain from his face. He tried to backpedal those sentiments. The living outside of this hometown really gave me a better understanding of how harmful a lot of these stereotypes that are perpetuated by mass media, by Hollywood, by video games on our devices, by the images that we're seeing. I mean, even just the coverage right now, as the mass media networks have been shifting a little bit of their narrative about what's going on in Palestine. It's positioning women and children as the victims while ignoring the men who are having to dig their families out of the rubble, right? Because the men are the big bad Arab guys. And so I think that I would agree from a solutions perspective that those of us that occupy spaces that are underrepresented in media, it's important for us to use our voices, however far that reach is, to tell those stories, because otherwise they're not being heard.
Indeed. Thank you, FATOOMA. And Robin, we're about out of time, but you wanted to add?
I just wanted to bring the discussion, I guess, back to Roger's film, and just to kind of marvel at the segment that you put in, Roger, about the long road home, where the military guy lectures the woman who said, "What is this, a war about gas and oil?" And he says, "Lady, there's 2 million oppressed people that have been under the boot of dictators. And that's why we're going in, you know." And it's just that the military as a benevolent force is going to change the lifestyles and the betterment of all of these people that we always go in and attack and kill. And it's a very terrible message to be constantly telling the American public.
Roger Stahl, let's complete the panel with you. There were a number of other things that I'm afraid we're out of time and we won't get to, including how might CGI obviate permission problems in the future with the military, and also that aren't the military, aren't those things ours? Aren't they part of taxpayer money? Shouldn't we be allowed to use them? I mean, if we wanted to use them for film, why do we need permission for taxpayer funded things? I mean, again, interesting things coming up in the Q&A, and I apologized earnestly for not being able to get to everything. I'm just mindful of the clock, and I want to give Roger Stahl, the filmmaker, of the great movie that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. It's Theaters of War, How the Pentagon and CIA Took Hollywood. Roger Stahl.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. That is very kind of you, and expanding the conversation, you know, to the kind of bigger media sphere and the kind of information warfare that we're seeing is a really great exercise. CGI, let me just knock these two off real quick. CGI came of maturity in the 2000s, and the kinds of requests, according to the office itself, have only gone up because it's still way, way cheaper and way more realistic to do business directly with the military. So it hasn't made a dent. Strangely enough, it's counterintuitive, I know. Taxpayer money, always a source of controversy. And whenever this office and a controversy regarding this office rears its head in public culture, it's all about taxpayers are paying for what? And there might be a congressional inquiry, and there might be some pushback in Congress. So that's also a very sensitive issue that they're very keen to tamp down on. And what they've done in doing that is charge filmmakers a nominal fee in order to tamp down that criticism, which was implemented in 1961 after a controversy regarding the film The Longest Day. And then after that, they generally get around having to charge filmmakers by integrating their services into what they call legitimate training operations. So that's how they maintain leverage. They want to give it away for free, but they found out loopholes for doing that in the meantime.
I'd like to go. Thank you so much, Roger Stahl. I want to thank, again, I apologize that we're out of time. We're 5 minutes over, and I'm on the left coast where the sun is still out. Our wonderful co-sponsors and friends at the Media Education Foundation, MediaEd.org. It's 8:35 back east, and I want to be mindful. I know Roger and Robin are back east. Many people are. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I encourage you to see Theaters of War if you have not seen it already, or watch it again. There have been some links in the chat, and that lets you know how you can get to watch the film. It's available for free until this week, March 7th, Thursday. So Media Education Foundation has made that available. If you haven't seen it, see it. It's certainly worth seeing again. If you'd like to have conversations like this one where you live, we invite you to host a screening of the film Theaters of War on your campus, organization, or community. Please visit go.mediaed.org/theaters of war for more information, or mediaed.org. I'm Mickey Huff from Project Censored. To learn more about our work, our show, our documentaries, and all the work that we do related to tonight's topics, please go to projectcensored.org, and to see our publishing imprint and the many books we do around critical media literacy education as an antidote to many of these problems that we face, you can go to censoredpress.org. I would like to thank you again, Roger Stahl, Robin Anderson, FATOOMA SAAD, and MNAR ADLEY. Very special thanks to our co-sponsors at Media Education Foundation, Emily, Alex, and the whole wonderful team there. I want to thank all the Project Censored team, some of whom were in our audience, for supporting and just really making this event take place. Finally, last not least at all, a special thank you to all of you for joining us in conversation about this really important and timely topic this evening. Thank you for the excellent questions. If you'd like to contact us, you can get in touch through mediaed.org. If you'd like to contact me, Mickey at projectcensored.org. Certainly would like to hear more from you, and we would just really appreciate this event and all of your participation. Thanks so much. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thanks so much for coming. Take good care. Thanks, everybody.